First, tonight we're going to talk about the teachings of Jesus. Then we're going to start looking into the early church histories, things like that. Because we're looking for the answer to the question, should Christians go to war? Okay? That's an important question. Because war is terrible. Plain and simple. You think of all the things that have happened throughout the ages, millions and millions of people have died all around the world, good and bad. Right? Whole cities, nations, entire civilizations have been wiped out. They've been completely destroyed because of war. Those are facts that cannot be denied. Right? And I don't think anyone could deny them. Because, on the other hand, it seems that war is sometimes necessary. Right? Despite all the savagery and the bloodshed and the destruction and the pain and suffering, it seems that sometimes it has to be. You think and you look back through history, you can see that sometimes men gather together to punish evil. Right? There's some force that rises up. Or to defend freedom. Right? That's a common theme in the world today. Oh, we want people to have freedom. Right? Today we do things a lot in the spread of democracy. Right? Destroying dictators and tyrants, people that are in power and abusing their power. Society sees the need to go and defend the innocent and the weak. Right? And what way can you do that? But as Christians, when we think about our lives and what we are and how we came to be, we know that Jesus came to set people free from sin and death. Right? There's no denying that as well. Huh? And when he came, he did not bring armies. Right? He did not use force. He did not even punish or threaten anyone. If you look at his story, he taught people about love and peace and mercy. And he even went and died meekly and quietly. Right? Even though it was unjust, unfair, he had done nothing wrong, he went to his death as a sacrifice for sin, to pay the price, to set everyone free from death and destruction. Okay? Now, on the other hand, Jesus taught about loyalty. He taught about justice. He taught about submission to authority. So, when we think about Jesus and we think about who we are as Christians, we have to balance. We have to say, how do I balance my desire to be like Christ with my obligation to society? Right? Because Jesus taught about both. We're expected to follow his example, but the question that really is behind this seminar, should Christians go to war, is this: how far do we really go in following the example of Christ? Right? How much of what he did is what we need to do, and how much of it was specifically for him? Now that's an important question. And I hope that as we go through the teachings of Jesus tonight, and we go through some of the considerations from his life, that we'll find the answer to that. Right? And we'll see what he expected his disciples to do. And we can understand what our obligations to society are. Okay? So, should Christians go to war? That's the question that we have. Now, for most of Christianity, over the last 1,000+ years, the answer has been yes. You look at the history of Christianity, Christians have gone to war time and time again. Right? Sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for bad. Well, there's no denying that. Like we said, sometimes to defend freedom and things like that. Sometimes it was just a bloody crusade. Trying to go and destroy all the evil in the world with nothing to stop them. Right? And no check on their own actions. Right? But they just went and did all the horrible things that the people before them had done. Other times we see Christians gathering together, like I said, for freedom. Right? And trying to defend the poor and the innocent from suffering. Set them free. Serving their country. Fulfilling their obligations. But this answer of yes has never been a unanimous one. Every time there's been a war that Christians fought, there have been some who would not, who refused, who felt that their obligation was different. And so this question of should Christians go to war has never gone away. We've been asking it generation after generation. And so our desire in this course, in this seminar, is to find the answer. Right? And to see. Because this is a question with very serious consequences. Should Christians go to war or not? Should anyone go to war? Right? Anytime you're going to go to war, you need to count the cost. Because war can accomplish great things, but it does it at a heavy price. Well, again, there's no denying that. And those consequences are for the individual and society as a whole. So this is definitely a question that needs to be answered. I think every Christian has a duty to really examine these things. Right? For him or herself to look at the evidence and make a decision. Right? Not to go on their feeling or what someone else told them to believe or whatever. Not what their parents taught them or what their government tells them. But to really go back and look, because the facts are there. We can see what Jesus taught. We can see how his early disciples lived and what they believed. And we can use that as a guide for our own life today. So our study that we're going to go through here is based on a book called The Early Christian Attitude to War. This was written by an Englishman named C. John Cadu in 1919. A long time ago, almost 100 years ago, he wrote this book. I have a copy of it here that I printed out. It's very large, you can see. There are 3 pages per page, front and back. It's over 250 pages, this book that we're going through. He wrote the book because he wrote it as a contribution to Christian ethics. Because there's no book like it in English. Right? Even at that time, there were several books, several things. You know, we said this is a big question. It's a big question that needs an answer, but yet, where can you find the answer? There's so many books that talk about this and that, just a little piece here and there, maybe a chapter, but no one has looked at all the evidence. And as you know from our studies and classes here at the Bible Study Center, that's what we like to do, right? Look at all the evidence. So, this book he wrote in response to that there was a book that looked at a lot of these things in German, but it was not translated into English at that time, and even today I can't find a copy of it on the internet. I tried, but I couldn't find one. So this remains the only comprehensive volume on the early Christian attitude to war in English, which means it's the only one I can read. probably goes for you. So it's very helpful because he looks at a lot of things. We're going to begin tonight with the teachings of Jesus. Right? We're going to look first at what does he say on the subject of war. Right? Does he say anything particular about war? What are some things that he teaches that would make Christian participation in war unacceptable? Right? What are some things? We talked about Jesus' teachings about love and peace. Right away you think, well, love and peace don't really fit together with war right away, sometimes you might try to fight a war to make peace, but people just look at that and say, that doesn't make sense, right? So what about Jesus' teachings? What do they have to say about Christians going to war? Also, aside from the things that he taught, we have several incidents in his life, several things that he did. We can see. Are there any considerations that might make it acceptable for Christians to go to war? Right? Maybe Jesus, in general, didn't believe in the use of violence, but in specific cases, it might be acceptable. Right? We have to decide. We have to determine that. Right? And really, if you look at the Christian thought on that, the idea of a just war, right, is the idea that war is bad. But there are some circumstances, some very particular circumstances where you ought to go to war, and you can. It has to be done in a certain way. Right? And so we want to really investigate the teachings of Jesus and see what does he have to say about that. What does his life tell us about that? Afterwards, after we establish Jesus' position and see what he taught and what he believed, we're going to move on to the early church. Right? And see how did they apply that? How did they apply that teaching? What did they see his intention as? Because they're much closer to him than we are. In time, there were not nearly as many traditions and divisions and all these things in religion that affected their point of view. So we can go back and look at that. We're going to look at two things. First, the early Christian disapproval of war. Right? Ways in which they disapproved war. We're going to look at their condemnation of war in the abstract. Just basic statements about how war is bad. War is divisive and kills people, and just different statements like that. We're going to look at the essential peacefulness of Christianity. Christianity is very connected with peace, right? And as we said, that kind of goes against the idea of war, right? How did Christians treat their enemies and wrongdoers, right? And how does that reflect about their attitude toward war? What evil things did they experience at the hands of soldiers, right? We know Christians were persecuted, and those persecutions were carried out by the hands of soldiers, the Roman army. Right? How did that affect their idea about participating in war, and living as a soldier? And then finally, we're going to look at the Christian refusal to participate. Right? Because we have evidence of many, many Christians that refuse to participate in war. After that, we're going to look at the other side, because we have to be fair. We have to consider all the evidence. We have to see how these early Christians accepted war. Right? What are some ways that they thought it was acceptable? Right? We're going to look at the use of military terms and phrases that illustrate religious life. Paul and many others talked about us being soldiers and having armor and all these different things. How does that affect the Christian idea of war? We're going to look at the wars of the Old Testament and the wars of Hebrew history. Okay? Because those had a bearing on the mind of Christians. We're going to look at apocalyptic wars, right? Wars that are coming in the future. Right? The end of time. How does that affect our idea? We're going to look particularly at the Jewish War of AD 67 to AD 71. Right? That's when the Romans came in and destroyed the city of Jerusalem. and the temple and all that. How did Christians feel about that? We're going to look at the idea of war as an instrument of divine justice. Because Christians accepted that God used war to punish. We're also going to look at how they felt about the functions of the state. The things that the government has to do. Right? Their obligations. We're going to look at the other side of the Christians' experience with soldiers. What good things did they experience with soldiers? It wasn't all bad. Right? The evidence is not one-sided. And then finally, we're going to look at Christian participation in military service. Right? Because even in this early time, as we see, there are Christians that participated in war. Right? And so we want to see, how do all these things come together? Right? Once we look at all that, there's a lot of material, but we can finally come to a conclusion. Right? About how Jesus felt, how the early church felt about the idea of warfare. And we can see, how does that apply to us? Right? Like we talk about in our classes. First, find the original meaning, right? Then you try to see how does it apply to you. Look at the context. That's what we're going to do over the next several days. Now, the teachings of Jesus. In the New Testament, Jesus never speaks directly on the subject of war. Right? He never tells his disciples, don't go to war. Or go and fight. Right? It's never there, one way or the other. That makes our task a little more difficult. Because we have to look at other considerations. But we should understand Jesus' silence on the subject. Just because he doesn't say anything doesn't mean that he thinks it's great. Right? Or that he thinks it's bad. He had no occasion to talk about it. And you can see that because, remember, Jesus lived and worked among Jews, Palestinian Jews, right? Living there in that one place, that one province of Rome. And he never went really outside of that. Okay? He didn't go to the Gentiles. He didn't go to this place and that place. He was there among one group of people. Now, there were very few soldiers compared to the number of civilians in that place. Right? Many of the Roman legions were stationed around the borders of the Roman Empire. Right? The Roman Empire was enjoying a pretty interesting period of peace at the time that Jesus came along. Right? So there weren't a lot of soldiers in that area. There were some. Right? We see centurions and soldiers stationed there in different places. But on the whole, there wouldn't have been very many soldiers for Jesus to even speak to. Right? Another interesting fact is that Jews could not be forced to serve in the Roman army. One of the emperors before had made it where the Jews were exempted from military service, right? Because of their religious peculiarities, right? All the other soldiers, they would offer sacrifices and do these different things and honor the emperor, but the Jews didn't really like to do that, and so they decided not to force them to do it, right? To let them live and practice their own thing. So if Jews can't be forced, well, then they could only become soldiers by choice. And considering that being a soldier requires you to engage in all sorts of idolatry, the Jews weren't really interested. Right? So that's a big consideration. Another thing is that there were some military groups, the forces of Herod and the temple police, but Jesus' disciples were very unlikely to be drafted into that. It was not very likely that they were going to pull them in. You have to serve in the temple today and guard. There were plenty of volunteers, both for that and, as we'll see, in the Roman army in general. So it makes sense then that Jesus wouldn't have much to say about war because it wasn't really an issue. And when things aren't an issue, you've got more important things to talk about. Jesus had a lot of things to talk about in a very short time to do it in. And he even says at the end of his life, I got a lot more to tell you, but there's no time. And so there are some things that he kind of left out. Now, thinking about that though, there are some statements that Jesus makes that are inconsistent with the lawfulness of Christians in war. Right? In other words, these things that Jesus tells his disciples, they go against the idea that Christians could participate in war. Right? It doesn't line up. Right? They're opposed to each other. And we're going to look at several of those. Much of Jesus' teaching and much of his life, they really go against the idea that he would allow his disciples or himself to go to war. Right? We said all these things about peace, love, mercy. We're going to investigate some of those today. The first is his command, thou shalt not kill. Okay. Now, this was in the Ten Commandments. Right? Jesus addresses it in the Sermon on the Mount. He said, you've heard that it said, do not kill. Right? But I tell you, whoever is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Far from taking this law and saying, oh, that's too strict. Right? He says, he makes it even stricter. Right? Instead of don't kill, don't be angry with your brother. Right? He says, whoever says to your brother, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Right? So that in itself makes us wonder for a minute, right? If we're not supposed to kill, even more than that, we're not supposed to be angry, then how could we go to war? But there are some considerations with this statement. Aside from that, though, he says later on in Matthew chapter 18, he talks about acts of homicide, right? Murders, right? Or homicides. It's a general word for killing. He says those are one of the evil things that comes out of a man's heart that make him unclean. Right? He includes that along with adulteries and fornications and theft and all sorts of things. Right? Many of the sins that he was talking about. Now, we have to remember though that the law of Moses allowed and even commanded capital punishment and war. Right? The Jews were required to go against and fight and destroy the Canaanites. When people committed certain sins, God told them that they were to give them the death penalty. Right? People were to be put to death for blasphemy, for adultery, for murder, for many, many sins. Right? So that has an interesting bearing on our conversation. Now, this command, thou shalt not kill, is from the Ten Commandments. The Hebrew word really does mean murder, right? Almost exclusively. It's never used to talk about warfare, right? But it is used twice in the book of Numbers to talk about an execution, right? So a murderer being murdered, right? One by the revenger, the avenger of blood. One of the family members of the one who was killed who will go and kill the murderer, and he will not be guilty. Right? Or a witness, like a false witness, who's trying to convict someone, and if it turns out that it's false, he's to be guilty. Right? So there's this evidence of the society, right? The leaders there of the community murdering the murderer. So that's how the word is used. Now, the Greek word that's recorded in the Gospels, right, where Jesus says, "Thou shalt not kill," that word just means killing. Right? It's a general word. It's used for murder. It's used for warfare. It's used for several different things. Right? So we can't really rule out this command because of that. We also have to keep in mind that even though this command is about murder, particularly, there is a connection, a similarity between murder and killing in war. There's a distinction. People make a big distinction about killing in war and murder on the one hand, but they both involve killing somebody. And so when you think about that, and you think about the fact that Jesus oftentimes took a law from the old Jewish law and he adapted it and he extended it in a way that it usually wasn't thought to apply. Right? He could very easily be taking this command of thou shalt not kill and applying it to more than just murder. And he really does, extends it even to anger, right? And the feelings that we have. So that's something to keep in mind. He does the same thing when talking about adultery and divorce and neighborly love and many things like that. So that's one piece of evidence. Another thing is Jesus' non-resistance teaching. Right? Later in the Sermon on the Mount, he says this: "You've heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not stand against one who is evil. Whoever strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And the one wishing to take you to court and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to the one asking from you, and from him who wishes to borrow from you, do not turn away." He goes on. He says, "You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those persecuting you, so that you may become sons of your Father who is in heaven. Because he raises his sun on the evil and the good, and rains upon the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? If you greet only your brothers, what extra do you do? Do not even the nations do the same? Therefore, be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect." That is his teaching of non-resistance. You can see that. Right? Don't stand against an evil person. Love your enemies. Right? Those ideas are hard to reconcile against going to war. Now, these teachings are very difficult to obey. Right? And that has led many people to try to find some way to escape from them. You look back in the discussions about these verses and everything, and there's lots of ways that people try to say, well, Jesus didn't mean that literally, right? He's just saying something. Some people might say, oh, you've got to really follow the spirit of the law, right? Not the letter. The problem with that is a lot of times people just end up ignoring the letter and the spirit, right? If you say people don't have to follow the law, then, well, they won't follow it. But even if you believe that we have to follow the Spirit, you have to ask yourself, is it acceptable? Can I follow something that's exactly the opposite of the letter and still be following the same Spirit? Right? Is it following the Spirit of love your enemies to kill your enemies? Is it following the spirit of the letter of turn the other cheek by striking back and killing the person? Right? Or even not killing them, just hitting them right back in the face. Right? That's not following the spirit or the letter. So that's something that we have to consider. That's not really a valid way to look at it. Some people say, well, these things are only valid in a perfect society. Right? Jesus was saying things that he was expecting people to do if it's a perfect world. Right? But our world isn't perfect. Well, the answer to that is pretty easy. Right? In a perfect world, there wouldn't be wrongs to endure. There wouldn't be enemies to love. So Jesus is clearly not talking about in a perfect world. He's telling his disciples something to do. Now, another objection that we see might be that these things only apply to our personal feelings, right? Our personal actions. Now, that could be possible. You look at that, Jesus is talking to them, right? That's a very plausible idea. But we can't just accept that at face value without really looking at it. We have to investigate. Could it be? Right? Or what can we see that would not do that? One is that in the statement that Jesus makes, the court, right, is the one persecuting the people, right? So they're helping along. Whoever wants to take you to court and and take your tunic away. Right? So already the court is against me, right? Because the idea here that we're only supposed to follow this in our personal feelings, but that if we have some duty to society to do these things anyway, right? When it's not just personal. But here the court is the one doing, that's a problem. In addition to that, we look at the law that Jesus talks about. Right? You've heard that it was said eye for eye and tooth for tooth. Right? That law, it's not a law about personal revenge. Mm-hmm. That is the law of the public punishment for sin. Right? You look back in the old law, if someone was injured, right? And it makes sense, because if it's life for life, well, if I get killed, I can't personally take revenge on you and kill you back. If you cut off both my arms, I'm going to have a problem cutting off both your arms. Right? It's a punishment by the state. Right? God gave that command to the Jews, to His people, so that when a wrong was done, when someone was injured or someone attacked his neighbor or hurt him in some way, that the penalty would be paid back. Exactly. So that there would be no escalation of violence. It just ends. And in Deuteronomy 19, this is very interesting. It's even used against a witness, a false witness, right? Who doesn't even inflict an injury, but is just trying to get someone punished with something, right? Whatever he intended to do to the person he's lying about, well, you do to him. And you do, that's the court, that's the society doing that, not the person. So when Jesus is talking about these things, he quotes this law really to forbid his disciples to use it, right? You've heard that it was said eye for eye, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person, right? Do not stand against them. If they take you to court, you just give them more, right? If they want to ask you for something, you give it to them. If they want to force you to go somewhere, you go even further. And if they hit you, you just let them hit you again. This isn't just something about personal violence. It really applies to more than that. But, again, that's not easy. And people don't want to follow that. But what are we going to do? And that's a whole different lesson. Moving on. Another consideration is that Jesus refused to advance his ideas through politics and force, right? Political and coercive means. He didn't go around forcing people to do something. It's very interesting. The Jews, they wanted an independent nation, right? That was like the one part of the Roman Empire that wanted to be free from the empire, right? And wanted to have their own country again, right? Everyone else was pretty happy, with all the benefits. The Jews, they thought the Messiah was going to come and defeat the Romans and drive them out and set up the kingdom of David again, right? That's what they were looking for. They wanted a warrior. But Jesus didn't do that. We see in John chapter 6 that Jesus refused to be made a king. He saw these people were about to come and make him their king, and he ran away. He disappeared. We see that when John the Baptist was imprisoned by Herod, when John the Baptist was beheaded and killed, Jesus did not try to punish Herod for his death. Right? Jesus didn't go try to get him free. He didn't go force Herod to give in to his demands. Jesus didn't try to punish Pilate. He didn't try to punish Pilate for the death of some Galileans that he had killed and mixed their blood with the sacrifices. Right? There's no record of Jesus doing anything about that. We never see him using physical force or threats to make people do good or to make them stop doing wrong. Right? There's no evidence. There's one incident that we'll talk about later on tonight, the incident in the cleansing of the temple. Right? We'll talk about that later on. But we don't see him using force. He says things like peacemakers. will be called children of God. Right? The gentle will inherit the earth. Right? He demands forgiveness of all sins. That's the requirement for giving forgiveness. If you want God to forgive you, you have to forgive everybody else for the things that they've done against you. That's a pretty powerful statement. Really, the best example of all of this is his refusal, his behavior on his last day, the last day of his life. What did he do? Did he fight? No. He didn't try to escape. He doesn't resist. Right? They pull him along. He doesn't insult them or threaten anybody. He even forbids his followers to strike out in his defense. Right? He tells Peter to put the sword away. Right? He just mildly rebukes Judas. Judas, you betrayed me with a kiss. Right? That's all he said. His captors do things, they strike him. He says, if I said something wrong, why did you strike me? He doesn't strike back. He doesn't do anything. Even while he's being crucified, while he's on the cross, he asks God to pardon all those people. He says, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Right? That doesn't sound like a guy who's wanting to go to war. He had a purpose to come. Now, Jesus expresses disapproval of how the Gentiles exercise authority. When the disciples are arguing about who's the greatest and all of that, he comes to them and he says, you know that those who are considered to rule over the nations lord it over them. And their great men exercise authority over them. But it's not so with you. Whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. For the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Right? Jesus, we see here, he did not want his disciples following the example of the Gentile authorities. Right? When you think of the Gentile authorities, well, how did they exercise their control? Well, through the power of their army, through the punishments of their laws, right? Through all sorts of things, taxation and fear, and full of corruption. Right? But Jesus says, you're not supposed to be like that. You're supposed to be a servant, a slave of all. Right? It says the Son of Man didn't come to be served, he came to serve and to die. Right? Jesus serves as the example for the disciples to follow in their leadership. Right? That's a very different kind of leadership. Jesus says, we're going to look at 4 things real quick that Jesus says, incidental utterances. Just things he says in a few different places that lead us to believe that he did not believe it was lawful for Christians to go to war. One is this. He says, neither do I condemn thee, go and sin no more. You're probably familiar with this story, right? When the Jewish leaders brought an adulterous woman there, and they brought her to Jesus, and they said, we caught this woman in the act of adultery. Right? The law says she's supposed to die. And so Jesus just kind of looks around and says, well, whichever of you don't have sin, you can throw the first stone. Right? And then he just waits quietly until they all go away. And then he says, neither do I condemn thee, go and sin no more. Now to be fair, this story is not in the oldest Greek manuscripts that we have in German. Right? It is in some old Latin manuscripts, and in a few pretty old Greek manuscripts, but none of the oldest. So it's probably not originally part of the book of John. Some manuscripts even have it in the book of Luke. But that doesn't mean that it's not an accurate historical account, right? Or an account of a real historical event. Because it is a very old story and it does sound a lot like Jesus. So, yeah, I say that for what it's worth. But here in this story, what does Jesus do? The penalty for death, the penalty for adultery under the law of Moses was death. But he set aside that death penalty. Right? He would not condemn this woman to death. It shows that he had a determination not to use physical violence, right, in punishing wrongdoers. That was the punishment. That's what she was supposed to get. But he didn't do it. Why? Well, that's another question, but we can see that he didn't. Even when it was supposed to be. Instead, he had mercy on her. He says in another place, flee into the mountains. In, I believe it's the book of Mark, Jesus is talking about the future. What's going to happen. The disciples say, well, what do you mean the temple is going to be destroyed? And he starts telling them about these things. And he says that the temple is going to be destroyed, right? That the Romans are going to come in. He doesn't say Romans necessarily. It's kind of an apocalyptic thing, right? You kind of have to sort out some things. He references the book of Daniel here. It says when you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong, right? What does that mean? Well, it says let the reader understand that those in Judea flee to the mountains. Right? So in other words, destruction is coming on this place. Right? He knew that was going to happen. And he told his disciples, run away. Right? Don't stay and fight. If you look at the history, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the war, the Jewish war. The Jews stayed and they fought. Even the Essenes, even the different groups of the Jews that they really didn't like fighting, they stayed and they tried to defend their city. And the Romans crushed them. But the Christians ran away. It's very interesting. So, why did Jesus tell his disciples to flee and not to fight? Right? That's an interesting thought. Another one is this: put your sword back into its place. For all who take the sword die by the sword. Will perish by the sword. You know when he says this, he forbids the use of the sword, right? Even in the defense of others. He says, put it away. You take the sword, you're going to die. Now, Jesus says this in the hours leading up to his death, right? Just before while he's being arrested. So there's an argument that Jesus meant this statement only for Peter right then, right? Because he had to be captured. Right? He had to go and die. That was all God's plan. Right? That's the idea. But how do we know that this isn't a statement that's to be applied more generally? Right? After all, the statement that Jesus makes is perfectly general. Right? The truth that he expresses is perfectly general. He doesn't say, Peter, if you use that sword, you're going to get killed. Right? No, he says, all who take the sword will perish by it. Right? That's a perfectly general thing. And inasmuch as that's a perfectly general statement about the truth of the sword, then it seems that maybe his prohibition to not use it, to put it away, is just as general. Maybe not, but that's something that we have to consider. You know? We can't just rule this out so easily. Another thing to think about, though, here, is that, if Jesus' death was a sacrifice for sin, right? If Jesus was going to die so that he could give his life for all these people, and sure, that had to happen, right? After the fact, is it right for Jesus' followers to go and to fight and to destroy their enemies and not give them a chance to repent? Give up. This is a little outside the direct teachings of Jesus, but it's something to think about. Right? We know the scripture tells us that God doesn't want people to perish. He does not delight in the death of the wicked, but wishes them to repent. Right? And so if Jesus died for all these people, is it honoring his sacrifice to kill our enemies? Basically condemning them to hell. That's a difficult statement. That's a difficult idea. And that's a kind of a hard thing to get around, I think. Something we have to consider, though. Jesus told Peter, put your sword away. For those who take the sword, die with the sword. He also says after that, after he's been arrested and he's before Pilate, Pilate's asking him if he's a king, right? Are you really the king of the Jews? And Jesus eventually tells him, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. Right? Very interesting. Well, Jesus says his kingdom's not like other kingdoms. Goes back to what we were talking about with the Gentile authority, right? Jesus told his disciples, your authority is not like their authority. Right? You don't do things the way that they do. Right? He says, my kingdom's not of this world. Now, he says, my servants. Is he talking about angels? Is he talking about people? Right? We don't know for sure. Right? I guess you could make the argument, oh, he's talking about angels. He talks about, don't you know that I could call down 10,000 angels? Right? But it doesn't seem to be what he's talking about. Granted, Peter tried to fight, but he told him no. Then all the disciples ran away. So I don't think it's enough that he could just say he's talking about angels. And here, obviously, again, we come to this idea, it was necessary that he had to die. Right? He had to be handed over, he had to die. Right? But again, after Jesus' death, what motivation do his followers have to fight? You have to have that. You have to have a legitimate reason for the followers to fight after that. And as we saw, there's a good reason for them not to. So when we think about this, we have to consider that Jesus has a different kind of kingdom than the ones that we're used to. Right? With different rules than the rules of the world that we live in. So looking at all these things together, is thou shalt not kill, not just that, but whoever's angry with your brother. His thoughts on non-resistance, right? Teaching his disciples to not resist when is evil, to turn away, to turn the other cheek when they're attacked, right? Not to seek retribution for injuries against them. Not to fight people in court even, but to just give the person what they want. Told his disciples to flee, to put your sword away. He didn't condemn anyone to death. Right? All these things together provide us with a pretty strong body of evidence for the fact that Jesus really refused to use physical violence. Right? We don't have any evidence. We're going to talk later, like I said, about the cleansing of the temple, which is offered as one objection. But he didn't use it, right, to stop wrongdoing or even prevent it. Right? And he also didn't use those acts of violence that we think of as used by society as a whole, right? Not just the individual. So not just retaliating against people for hurting you, but like I said, not punishing those crimes with death. but seeking forgiveness. This evidence also supports the belief that he didn't permit his disciples to use violence either. Right? He told them again and again. And so when we think about that, if you're not allowed to use violence on your neighbor, if you're not allowed to use violence on someone who attacks you, right? If you're just supposed to take it meekly, quietly, without insult or threat, if we follow Jesus' example, then Christian participation in war is out of the question. You know? For Christians to go and fight and kill people, possibly each other, that doesn't fit with these teachings that we see. But we still have some more study to do. Now we've got to go and make a careful study of the other side. Because there are some objections, right? There are some things that, some considerations that have to be made and people look at that we need to think about. And see, is there any exception to this teaching that Jesus says? But we'll do that after our break. So